Hey everybody, so Ben Shapiro put out a video recently titled Ben Shapiro Debunks New York Times article on systemic racism. And the problem with the video is that I think he gets a lot of it wrong. And basically he looks at the article and he looks at all the different statistics and he provides his explanation for why he thinks the statistics are the way that they are. And so what I wanted to do is go along the video with you guys and point out where I think he's wrong and offer my counter explanation. So let's start it off.
As I mentioned, there's this article in the New York Times that highlights some of the gaps between white and black America in charts. So they show the unemployment rate age 16 years or over, and they show that basically the gap in the unemployment rate between black and white has been fairly consistent since 1960. It actually spiked a bit. The gap seems to have spiked a bit during the 1980s, but it has gone back down now to probably its lowest point. If you look at this chart, it looks like the lowest point in American history. That gap was about 3% up until the pandemic hit. Okay, which is a testament, frankly, to President Trump's economy. I mean, that obviously is a thing. But the unemployment rate, so the suggestion here is that if blacks are historically less employed than whites, even after the Civil Rights Act, and that the gap wasn't closed, then nothing must have changed. Or alternatively, a lot of things changed. Alternatively, there were Great Society programs that paid welfare. Alternatively, there were affirmative action programs designed to get people into college of minority races. Alternatively, there's a change in behavior as well. To simply look at the gap in the unemployment rate and then say racism, if all you knew was one factor, right, unemployment and racism, what you would suggest is racism hasn't changed, because this chart doesn't look like it changed all that much in terms of the gap. But obviously, many things changed.
And so he brings up a couple things there. He brings up welfare, affirmative action, and I think the thing that we can discern from this is that those programs were not all-encompassing enough and not effective enough. I think the affirmative action that this country has tried to do just hasn't been very successful. It just doesn't... I think that the answer, when you look at like college admissions, instead of letting in like a certain number of like black people at like a higher percentage than white people, or however these programs are structured, instead it should just be free. College should be free. It should be... Upper education should be offered free to everybody, because the problem with affirmative action is sometimes it singles out more affluent black people and it leaves behind people who grow up in very impoverished areas. And so there are still people left behind. And so I think affirmative action hasn't been successful. I think the welfare system hasn't been properly funded. I don't think it's been encompassed enough. And I think we see that as the unemployment rate really hasn't changed. And Ben Shapiro's argument is, well, things did change. We did try to help, but, it's clearly, it's unhelpable, that it's just unhelpable. And you ask Ben Shapiro, then what's the problem? If we fixed, there's no racism against black people anymore, what's the problem? He's like, well, there's differences in culture. That's what it would come down to. That's what he would describe it as. There's differences in culture. And that's really, I want to know what the implications of that are. Like, what does that mean? Because if we're really talking about it, black culture is overwhelmingly also consumed by white kids. Like, white kids listen to hip hop, they follow black celebrities. This isn't like hip hop is the number one music genre right now. And so that, overwhelmingly dominated by black Americans. And so I think that it's pretty fair to say that white kids get their fair dose of quote unquote black culture. And so that's, I don't think that that's really a fair argument. So what else does he mean by culture? And he'll talk about it a little bit more here.
Including the number of black Americans who are graduating from high school. The answer is 92%. Including the number of black Americans who are going to college. The answer is approximately, 26% now? Go through a 4-year college? So that is a massive difference. Okay, it's a massive difference. By the way, again, there's this chart. It shows share of people 25 years and over who completed 4 years of college or more. And it shows that the gap between white and black has actually risen a little bit since 1960. Not that many people went to college in 1960, period, between white and black. But now, today, 36% of white Americans over 25 completed 4 years of college. 26% of black Americans have completed 4 years of college or more, which is an amazing, amazing statistic, right? Over a quarter of black Americans are completing 4 years of college or more. Now, what you would have to recognize also is that the black dropout rate is a lot higher in college than the white dropout rate in college. Black student college graduation rates remain significantly low. The nationwide college graduation rate for black students stands at 42%. So there are a lot of black students who are going into college and then are not graduating college. And by the way, it's largely, statistically speaking, black men are more likely to drop out of college than black women are. But that...
And so I want to, touch on that. I touched on college a little bit. But why are they all dropping out then, Ben? What is it? Because he says, the reason is, they're all just dropping out. It's because college is expensive And if black people are more likely to be, grow up in poverty, well, then it turns out it's a lot harder for them to go to college because college costs a lot of money. And it would also explain why, because he talks about it in the 60s, a lot less people went to college. That number has risen, but the gap has grown. And the reason that the gap has grown is because prices for college have gone up so much. College has gotten so expensive. And so because of that, when you have these people that are disproportionately impoverished, you're going to see there be a larger gap that grows between, because they're less able to go to college. College was proportionately cheaper back then, so the gap would be smaller. And so let's go on.
Explain part of the gap. So one of the things that has happened is, again, people refuse to look at ancillary factors that might explain continuing gaps, because the idea is just a very simplistic single factor analysis. If there's a gap, that gap is due to continuing endemic racism. If you look at median household income, you see that there has been a continuing gap between white and black, and that the gap has actually risen in terms of median household income. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, why has the median household income gap risen, given the fact that racial discrimination in employment has been outlawed since the 1960s in both the private and the public sectors?
I would just like to point out, it has been proven time and time again that while it has been officially illegal, there is still racial discrimination in employment hiring that happens today. I mean, it's depending on they looked at just names on resumes, and a more quote unquote black sounding name is harder. People will look away from that resume than a quote unquote white sounding name. And so right there, we know that it still happens. And it's just so ridiculous. Does he think that the day that the Job Discrimination Act was passed, that people just didn't do it? People didn't discriminate anymore for jobs? Is that what he thinks? The people just stopped doing it? Of course they didn't stop doing it. There were probably people that still discriminated, and there were probably people that they didn't report it, because a lot of them probably didn't agree with it. And so I think that it's fair to say that it definitely happened, and there's empirical data that it still happens today.
Every state in the union. This is what the Civil Rights Act did. It's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, essentially. Why exactly is that gap still existent? Well, maybe it has something to do with high school dropout rates. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that so many public schools are failing black students, and so many black students are graduating from high school without actually having rudimentary skills and have to go into remedial education even if they go to college. I mean, there are significant gaps in the number of students by race who are going into remedial education once they hit college. Maybe this has to do with the fact that there are so many single moms, right? That changes the median household income. If the mom and dad are living together, the median household income, right? So mom and dad, their combined income is going to be higher. If more people are unmarried, that's two separate households now, right? So the household income is lower. In other words, what the New York Times is trying to do with all of this is...
Well, so let's talk about this median household income. I think that, he brings up, the number of single moms in the black community. Well, what is one reason why there might be more single moms in a very impoverished community? Could it be that, when young kids, they get someone, two people get pregnant, one of them, both of them live in poverty. A child is very expensive, and so they don't think that it's possible, and, the man tries to leave the situation. They try to get out of it. Do I think that's a good thing? No, I don't think that's a good thing. But is that a result of the circumstances? Probably, because, what else is the reason? Because why does Ben Shapiro think it's so high? Why does Ben Shapiro think that this rate of single motherhood, and also, I do think it's a very cyclical thing. If you grew up without having a father, then yeah, you're probably more likely to, have a different relationship with that sort of thing. And I think that there's a lot of psychological evidence to show that that is cyclical, which means that we need to counteract that, because it all started because of these problems that we're talking about, because of Jim Crow, because of their growing up systematically oppressed. And so if nothing's ever done to fix that, to bring these people out of this poverty, it's very hard to get out of the poverty.
That racism is still the deciding factor in American life. And in fact, they make this absolutely clear in the New York Times piece. They suggest that in many parts of the country, black and white Americans continue to live in very different worlds. This distinctive feature of American inequality is not an accidental development, but rather a result of policy choices. Again, the idea is that historic discrimination is what has caused all of this, which would not really explain why the black middle class was growing faster in the 1950s before the Civil Rights Act than it did after the Civil Rights Act in 1965. Another example, the homeownership rate. So the homeownership rate prior to 1990, right, going all the way back to about 1980, there's a huge gap between white homeownership and black homeownership. Well, as black income has risen, and it has risen dramatically from 1960 and on, wouldn't you expect more black homeownership? And yet black homeownership is actually at the lowest levels that it has been since 1990. So what exactly is going on here? You can't really blame redlining for lack of homeownership by Black Americans in 2020 at this point. But what you can blame is rising real estate prices. And
I think I would like to point out redlining, it's been officially illegal. I mean, there's tons of research that suggests that like the practices of like the actual like effective redlining didn't stop necessarily. So just want to point that out.
income, right? That's what you can blame. How about sentenced male prisoners per 100,000 residents of the corresponding group? So the idea here is that Black Americans are being discriminated against in the criminal justice system. Okay, so the gap has actually dropped fairly dramatically from what it once was over the past 20 years. But for every 100,000 Black males, 2,272 of them will end up sentenced to prison, as opposed to 392 for every 100,000 white males. Is that the result of racism, or is that the result of individuals making criminal decisions? Right? The basic notion here that the New York Times is pushing, and this is the notion that the left is pushing, is that all inequality of outcome is due to discrimination, continuing discrimination in the system.
And so that last part, I feel like that really hits the nail on the head as to what Ben Shapiro's actual argument is. Because he says right there, he goes, all right, it shows that Black men are more likely to be incarcerated. He goes, could that be the product of discrimination? Or is it that they're just more likely to be criminals? They're just, or it could be discrimination, or they're just criminals. Like, that was really his argument. He was like, or it's because of criminal decisions. Which basically he's just saying like, oh yeah, Black people are just, more likely to be criminals. It has nothing to do with the fact that, crime is directly linked to poverty and Black people are disproportionately likely to live in poverty. But even when you account for that statistic, if you look at Black people and white people who committed the same crime, the Black person more often than not gets harsher sentencing. That's, I don't know what else you would explain for that. Like, what else you would call that? Like, when you have such, the incarceration rate is the most easy to look at example of how systems have still been weaponized against Black Americans. When you look at the war on drugs, when you look at just these awful sentencing policies, when you look at things like 3-strike laws and everything, it's just awful. 3-strike laws, I mean, those are just a mess, just in general. But I think that just really highlights it there, where he's, why are they more likely to be incarcerated? Well, it's because they're more likely to be criminals. That's his take on that one, and because he doesn't offer any other explanation. That's the only thing he says, and I think that isn't true. I think it's because poverty is linked to crime. I think that's very, very easy to explain, but he chose not to say that. And so that's kind of my debunking of Ben Shapiro's debunking of the New York Times article. If you guys disagreed with anything I said, please leave a comment down below. But if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and have a great day.